Welcome to the 775 Alive podcast, your rural Nevada headquarters for decoding politics, economics, and general global shenanigans. I'm Crystal Newton, your business strategist, breaking down why Nevada's hustle is stronger than a sagebrush root in a windstorm. Here with my trusty co-host, Scott Gaborski, PhD historian, here to explain the smart lessons of history, even if we are likely to ignore them. Grab your boots for a wild ride through today's most important news.
So welcome back to 775 Alive. We're just trying to get through the end of summer here before the Labor Day holiday.
Yeah, 2 weeks till Labor Day.
Yep.
And over in my neck of the woods, we have the Tri-County Fair, Pershing County, Humboldt County, and Lander County. We got the rodeo going on. We got music, entertainment, and they even bring some fair rides in, but they're the ones they put on the back of semi-trucks, so I don't know.
You don't trust them. Of course, we got the Oakland County Fair. We're starting to see politicians and officials come wandering through here. Candidates coming through here, so
moseying on through,
showing up at the fair parades. Of course, our big thing is we just recently put together, coming up here, of course, September 17th, Constitution Day.
Yes, and you have managed the impossible.
I don't think it was impossible.
It's been my dream the last year to try to bring Democrats and Republicans into one space to have a conversation. It seems like it's been impossible, but you managed it.
Yeah. So we're going to do here up in Elko, the Elko County Republican Party, the Elko County Democratic Party, and the Independent American Party, which are the three largest parties here, are going to come together on September 18th and do a panel discussion.
Well, let's see if that holds. We got a month where they can still back out.
Well, I don't think they're going to back out. They've been quite excited. This is a good way actually to look for some commonalities and similarities, even though we'll definitely divide on issues.
Now, tell me something. Is this going to be broadcast on the local radio?
Yeah, you saw where this is going. It's one of our local radio stations is going to broadcast it live. We're doing it at the Performing Arts Center at the high school, so they can just pull it off the thing, which gets us right into our topic today.
Yep.
The whole thing with public media.
We are talking about public media. The DOJ team found $9 billion in funding to cut, and $1 billion of that was public media.
Right.
And so is it relevant? Was it time for it to go? Is it going to create a big impact here in Nevada? How is this really going to hit? I know we've heard Catherine Marr come out and talk about everything's going to fail if we don't have public radio. So we thought we'd have a conversation just how that's going to work out.
And Catherine Marr, of course, we've had a lot of stuff. Not only was those rescission packages where they peeled back money out of that $9 billion, a little over $7.5 billion of it had gone to foreign operations, right? But they peeled back a lot of money, and it's in the upcoming fiscal year 2026, which is the appropriations packages they're working on now. There's no funding for the Corporation of Public Broadcasting.
Yes.
Which is the sort of agency that serves to hand money off to both public broadcasting system, PBS, the television, and then NPR, National Public Radio.
Well, and I think, this is an interesting entity from a business standpoint, because basically what the Corporation for Public Broadcasting does is a foundation. Their sole job is to take in money from the government and redistribute it to nonprofits like NPR or PBS. And they take 6%.
Yeah, about 6% is their operating overhead.
Yeah, so basically, we get upset over a 3% credit card charge, and these are our tax dollars being put out to good work, and they're charging a 6% overhead fee to take money from one and hand it to the other. So I think DOJ in this instance made the right recommendation for a cut.
Well, I think it's a much more complicated issue, and I'll point out for any of us in the nonprofit world, we're 15% sort of the cutoff, but a lot of times we're managing direct programs, food banks, and whatnot, so that there's much more direct expertise involved.
I should point out we're both nonprofit owners.
Yeah, yes, we are. Yes, but
we have a foot in that world.
But I think
we don't get federal tax dollars.
We don't get federal tax dollars, and why that came about, and that's part of why this story is so interesting. I think is that part of why that comes about, and this entangling of sort of potentially politically motivated, we'll put it that way, and public funding. But the thing that's getting us that I think is so fascinating about this is how the rurals are showing up in this.
Yeah,
because we have a string of politicians who claim that if this funding is cut to the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, which is already said it's going to spool down at the end of fiscal year 25, so September 30th, 2025, right? It's going to spool down operations. But if we cut NPR or cut PBS, it's rural areas that are going to suffer. And that's one of the things we want to look at is how true is this
Yeah.
in reality, right?
Just from a common sense standpoint, I really struggle with it in the age of Starlink and the internet. Everyone has a cell phone. It's hard to see where public media could serve something that only it can serve, especially in the age of podcasting. You have this enormous market blowing up, and they don't get tax funding, but they seem to proliferate.
Well, let's come back to that at the end, because I think there is an interesting parallel with podcasting. But let's stick first. Let's hear a little bit from Catherine Marr. Catherine Marr is, of course, the president and chief executive officer of the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, who's been at the center of a lot of this controversy.
Which I might add, she took that position in March 2024.
Oh, yeah.
And what a wild ride that has to have been for her. So, now, basically, entire funding is cut.
Right.
Her as a CEO, she's really going to have to figure this one out. Yeah.
This is going to be difficult.
But the big argument is like, people will die. The thing Democrats love to say, people will die. She's like, it's very important. Like, so I'm going to play this clip from her that you found.
Right.
And it was a great clip.
This is from Meet the Press back when the rescission cuts were passed back in July 2025.
The strongest argument on why we should keep giving $1 billion.
Yeah.
All right.
So here's your opportunity. How does NPR, how would cutting it be a risk to public safety?
So the most important thing for everyone watching to know is that these cuts are not about NPR. They are about the National Public Radio Network. 70% of all of the funds that are at risk right now go directly to local stations. Last night, while the Senate was on the floor debating this exact package, we saw a 7.3 register earthquake hit off the coast of Alaska. 3 stations immediately went into broadcast around tsunami warnings. The local sirens in their hometown told residents to tune in to their local radio station. Our staff in those, not our staff, local staff in those stations stayed on the ground at sea level, putting themselves at risk to make sure that their local residents had the information they need. This is just one of the many ways in which public safety broadcasting plays out in the public media system around the nation on a regular basis.
Yeah, and I think one of the things we hear there, is again this idea that somehow any type of funding cut in Washington equates to deaths out in the country. She's not necessarily wrong about that, although
I just heard the opposite in her argument. She said they hunkered down at the radio station to make sure everyone got the signal. And I was like, in the age of satellite, Nick, you don't need people hunkering down in a tsunami zone to put out the message.
Well, I disagree with that somewhat. I think there is a role. And in this case, it is sort of interesting. Now, I'll point out, I'm not too sure what those stations she's referring to actually are. And that's something we probably want to get into a little later, because I think one of the things that's really complicating this is what is a public media station. But that being said, I think it's interesting if we look at some other disasters that have happened. So you had one of the
Texas floods in this
right, Kernsville.
Yeah.
Well, Kernsville's a good one, and the St. Louis, Missouri tornado back in May.
Okay.
Right, both of those. The initial charge by some of the media was that, well, this is all the result of budget cuts out of Washington. Is why these people weren't warned. But what we come to now is that these are actually separate issues, that the warnings didn't go out because of problems that really had nothing to do with the budget cuts. In the Kernsville case, they apparently have not installed updated warning sirens, right?
It made for good news, though.
It made for good news. Well, it's a way to shift the narrative, and that's probably one of the problems here. But then again, I do think we have to balance it, because members of the North Carolina delegation actually came out very strongly in support, because apparently a lot of these smaller federally funded radio stations in North Carolina actually played a key role after the floods.
Yeah.
Right. So there's an interesting dynamic, I think, that happens here. My take is that a lot of this is far less catastrophic than it is being made.
Yeah.
Because I think it's based on 2 premises. One, that it's uniquely the rurals who depend on public media. Because 2, there's nothing else.
Right.
Right. And this is something I think that goes back to the early history. And I'd like to talk a little bit about the history here in a few minutes, because I think it's fascinating. But one of the arguments was, when all this gets started setting up in the 50s and 60s, is that these smaller markets would not see media because it wasn't viable commercially. So therefore, the government had to step in and support. The problem is, I'm not sure that's ever really the case. So, mentioned doing this Constitution Day, the station that's covering that is a commercial station.
Yeah.
And most of the or the quote unquote public media stations, right, part of the NPR network in Nevada, these aren't independent stations with one exception, right? And that was only set up in 2023 here in Elko, right? So it's barely 2 years old. But what they are is they're stations where NPR owns the rights, but they simulcast out of either the Reno or Las Vegas markets.
Right. So they're not really, serving the local market. Essentially, it's the same thing everywhere.
Right.
And we should point out from a financial aspect, like the dependency on federal funding really comes down to how much revenue actually comes from the federal government. And a lot of these local stations get more than 80% of their funding through their own exercise and fundraising. Even here at the Elko station, I know the Humboldt Republican Party purchases a set of ads for the years. And that's how they get their revenue, is by selling those independent things, which it goes to a bigger conversation I wanted to have with you. Is we kind of have a difference of opinion of how long should the federal government subsidize an industry before it should be able to stand on its own 2 feet and raise its own money, which is effectively an indication that the consumer values it and it buys into it. Public radio has been funded for 50 years. If you haven't figured out how to self-fund and operate as a business, I mean, you really should be left to wither away if that's the direction it's going to go. If people really love it, they will send in the money and it'll keep going. I think this is the right move.
Well, and I think, you were comparing it a little earlier to like NASA laying the groundwork for, and that was the issue I sort of took exception with. And now is probably a good time to dig into the history.
Well, I should flesh that out. So essentially my argument is like the space industry was seeded by the government, which means they put the initial upstart, got the industry going. But effectively, NASA, it cost them $1 million a pound to put something into space. And then you have a private sector where Elon can get a pound into space for $6,000 a pound. That's the trajectory you want to see when it comes to government investment and subsidies, with the exception of farming. They should forever be subsidized. But why do you think that public media is something that should be ongoing?
Well, I don't think it's necessarily something that should be ongoing, but I think there is one big difference, I think, with your space program example.
Okay.
And that's the fact that radio starts out commercially in the 1920s. What we know of as NPR is a creation in 1971, made possible by the Public Broadcasting Act of 1967, right? And PBS was established. So you at this point, what you were seeing is those were set up for industries that were already existing and thriving.
Okay.
Right. So this wasn't an effort to deface, or to not deface, but not an effort to somehow recoup startup cost.
Right.
Right. I mean, if we would have looked, it's astounding.
Same with education. We invest in our children, but we don't expect to get a return from them. They just go out and be a productive member of society.
But the argument that comes out of this, and I'll add, we're talking about NPR in this and radio, but there's also PBS, which is the television side, and television's not that new of a technology either. I mean, by 1928 we have the first sets. Betty White's doing television in the 1930s, late 1930s, right? So it's not something that only came about after World War II, although that was the massive expansion.
Betty White was the age of this hairdo.
Yeah.
I like it.
But anyway, the argument for public media was based on the idea that the type of stuff that needed to be out there, either educational, news oriented, or reaching small markets. And again, this is where the rurals come in. These were not attractive to big commercial industries seeking to serve a profit.
Sure.
So the government was coming in to bolster these marginal cases for the use of this technology to secure public access to it.
Well, and essentially it's a communication network, which was far more important back when there was no TV, there was no internet, there was no cell phones. It was, infrastructurally speaking, very important.
Right.
But again, I think it lends to my argument, in this day and age, it's matured out of that space.
Well, that's interesting that you mentioned network, because we just heard Catherine Muller talk about this, right? This is about the network they're trying to destroy. This is the infrastructure they're trying to destroy. I don't actually think that was as an important of a case to the content.
Okay.
And I think that's part of where we're bracing this, is that, should you does supporting the network, and you're right, we do have a built out infrastructure now for radio,
Yeah.
but does supporting an infrastructure necessarily mean unquestionably supporting the content?
Yeah.
And, internet's a good example of this. I mean, many towns here in rural Nevada have a problem with initially to encourage companies to come in and spend the capital to build the infrastructure. They were granted monopolies.
Yeah.
And then once the infrastructure is in a place, they just collected the fees and walked away, never updated it.
Yeah.
Which is one of the factors that is hampering rural towns, much more to the fact it's not that we don't have internet, it's that we can't work with the internet that was put into place 30 years ago when we granted the monopoly.
Yeah.
Right.
So I see there is a bit of an argument of having a publicly funded infrastructure that could, because the problem would become if everything is private media, then there's a bunch of siloing going on and nobody's really interconnected on one central platform.
Right.
But like you said, that central platform has become slanted. And so it isn't, in fact, a central platform. So
Right.
it's failing to serve its purpose.
And I think that's where the discussion really is going into place now. Does it serve that purpose? And remember that the Corporation of Public Broadcasting comes out of a series of privately funded initiatives for philanthropy in the 1950s. In some ways, earlier, there was a National Education Radio Network, NERN, that was set up, I think, by the Kellogg Foundation and then later picked up by the Ford Foundation.
Yes.
What's now PBS develops out of a 1954 project called National Educational Television Network. And again, the idea behind these is that this is content that wasn't viable for commercial shows to do. So, somebody in Philadelphia, for instance, just bear with me, somebody in Philadelphia, a local station might have an interest in producing a show that generates ad revenue because that's what they live by.
Of course.
And so given a choice, if you want to attract a younger audience, something along the lines of a Sesame Street or what develops in Philadelphia, Dick Clark's American Bandstand, which starts as a local show, they're going to go to Dick Clark's American Bandstand because there's more revenue.
Yep.
So the idea is this public support for public media secures that stuff that's perhaps critically necessary culturally, but is not economically viable.
Yeah. I wanted to shift a little bit to Nevada itself.
Oh, yeah.
Because I think, going back to those numbers of almost more than 80% of their revenues are raised locally to produce local content. So this argument that these federal dollars somehow.
Let's look at that a bit, because that's actually a bit of an interesting point in the fact that we have on locally how these cuts are being done. I think we have a cut from a local television broadcast with some people from PBS in Reno talking about the cut.
This is straight from the horse's mouth here locally, what it's actually going to look like on the ground. And it does illustrate that funding sources are, it's not as heavily dependent on federal dollars as Catherine Marr makes it out to be. Yeah.
Well, for KUNR and PBS Reno, it roughly will take about 15 to 17% of their total funding. So while they will get to keep the ship afloat in some capacity, there are some rural stations that rely on it much more, but it will still make it difficult for all of them because the losses will still be somewhat significant.
This is a very serious situation, and we are beyond disappointed.
Local public TV and radio stations tell us they are bracing for the impacts of the rescission package in Washington, D.C. that could total about $7 million in federal funding lost across the entire state. PBS Reno says the cuts will account for more than $1 million.
Now, that's not a huge portion of our PBS Reno budget. We raise 83% of our annual operating budget from the community.
Misha says they will plan to raise more money and feels like they'll be okay, but other organizations will have more legwork to do.
And so a number of stations, especially in small communities, rural communities, tribal communities, are really going to be in a hard spot.
So, it sounds like most of the radio stations are going to be just fine. Then there are a few that are going to suffer a bit, but it does feel like they're cherry picking a very small minority of instances where this is really going to hit hard.
Well, and I think there's a couple actually missions that. First of all, I agree, right? So this in the case was a television station, PBS, where we're talking about 83% of the revenue doesn't come from the federal government. They're raising it on their own. They're getting it from other sources. And if we remember, before this rescission package became real, one of the things we constantly heard for a number of years out of the Corporation for Public Broadcasting to theoretically keep Congress from taking too close a look. It's like, well, local stations don't get that much funding. It's really not that important. Don't bother wasting your time, was the hint. But there is a counter argument that's sort of interesting. The Knight Foundation. We'll talk about the Knight Foundation towards the end. They're one of the groups, again, private philanthropy that's coming in to save these radio stations. In a talk they gave, their president gave back here in May 2025, she estimated that for every dollar the federal government spends grants to a local station, that allows that station to go out and raise $8 additional locally, which gets you to that 83% he's talking about. The question is that $1 seed money actually that important?
It's a chicken and an egg question.
Well, and I think that's a real thing to look at, right?
Well, I mean, if you look at it from a business model standpoint, if you're able to raise $8 privately and $1 publicly, your business model functions as a private business.
Right.
That's enough revenue to be completely wholly functional without any crutch.
Right. Now, you might not be able to do everything you want.
No.
But, it is viable. That's a good word. Now, are there some other stations that might depend on it more? Potentially.
Yeah.
Right. And that's the thing that gets me about these clips and some of the people that have been talking about this. It is, but there's, I know rural stations or tribal stations somewhere that need this. And it's sort of like, well, where?
Yeah.
Right. I mean, it's funny. And part of this, I don't think, is necessarily malfeasance as much as it is. And of course, go back to the irony of an urban commercial station reporting and talking to an urban public media station about funding cuts in the rural. So it's like, why isn't anybody going out to the rurals? We don't have them. And that's the interesting thing. Most rural radio in Nevada is actually commercial.
Yeah.
Right. And the biggest exception to that, Radio Goldfields, which is broadcasting out of Goldfields, it's a nonprofit, so it's non-commercial radio, right? They probably do receive, they definitely receive some FCC grants, right, to build towers and this type of stuff and that. But they don't take a lot of NPR funding, but they're basically doing a radio station from Death Valley all the way up into central and eastern Nevada. And they're not NPR.
Yeah.
Right? I don't know if any programming they get comes from NPR.
Well, I think it's a little easy to get lost in some of these narratives surrounding public media. But at the end of the day, excuse me, I really do believe that the question of is it needed, a very, very important question to ask, can be answered by the consumer. And it is a bit of an oversimplification. It's my business mind working. But, if your NPR funding falls off to the point of critical failure for the radio station, and it is really needed, guess what's going to happen? The community is going to rally and raise money and fund it. Now, if they don't rally and raise money and fund it, I'm sorry to say the answer to your question is it was not needed.
Right. Well, and again, this gets back, I think, to this argument about the economic viability on stuff. And again, I'm not saying there's an absolute truth to this. I think it's interesting to point out one of the things that everybody's seen in this is like, well, if it wasn't for the Corporation of Public Broadcasting, we wouldn't have Mr. Rogers. What we forget is Fred Rogers was broadcasting, incidentally, out of Philadelphia, right, before the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, right? In fact, if I remember right, he testified in Congress in support of that bill. His show already existed. Right now, it was funded through private fundraising. Nothing, wasn't commercially viable in that sense. But it is an example here of something that pre-exists this massive government agency that we've now put together.
Well, and I think they've had narratives being pitted against each other that aren't appropriate to pit against each other. I think there was a very valid place for NPR and for public media and PBS, and it did seed things like Mr. Rogers, Sesame Street. And it did, like, publicly funding it and generating all that content was a wonderful thing to do. The ideas got seeded into our economy and our marketplace. So again, I come back to, if these ideas want to be flourished, they should be supported by the end consumer at this point.
Right.
So it's like, yes, it did serve all these purposes, but not anymore.
And that brings it up because some of the stuff you pointed out is, we'll if I can do two examples. One
Yeah.
is Sesame Street.
And we're going to talk about Tickle Me Elmo.
And Tickle Me Elmo.
Somehow that comes up a lot.
Well, it's an interesting dimension. So Sesame Street is widely considered to be one of the success stories of American public media. So far that, if you remember when we did the Doge episode,
Yes.
right, the Sesame Street in Iraq was a focal point for the USAID, right? But more importantly, the nonprofit that was set up to produce Sesame Street, because PBS, this is one of the big distinctions. PBS, which is the television arm, NPR is the radio arm. PBS actually doesn't produce its own shows. Right. They buy off of local stations or like the BBC or increasingly other foreign media enterprises to bring in programming.
No, NPR spends their money producing their own content, and then PBS hands out money to already produce content that they'd like to license.
Right. Like they like the license. Now, that can still be a biased choice, no doubt about that.
Yeah.
But Sesame Street itself, what used to be Children's Television Workshop under Jim Henson is now known as the Sesame Workshop. That is a massive corporation. Right.
Yep.
They seem to bring in somewhere on the order of $120 million in revenue a year. And the
branding and licensing deals off the characters produced by publicly funded
that
programs.
becomes a little less. The revenue would include grants. But the $20 million for Tickle Me Elmo, right? I mean, that's a significant market, right? And the idea that somehow they need this federal fund to support an enterprise that's already bringing in $120 million a year in revenue is sort of a fascinating dynamic.
Yeah, no, it was time for it to go.
Right. My second example is actually back to those BBC shows, because we've all watched the PBS funding, right? If you want to keep seeing your BBC sitcoms or dramas, you need to give to us. That's the hard sell. Well, in some ways, the BBC in particular, or at least their licensing arm, in part has been raking American public broadcasting over the coals for years. Those things are expensive. I'm a Doctor Who fan, and the BBC has set it up where basically the Doctor Who I grew up with, the Doctor Who from the 60s, 70s, and 80s, you almost can't afford except to watch it in the United States on PBS.
Okay.
I mean, even when they sell DVDs, they're so outrageously priced compared to everything else. So you've got that dynamic where, in some ways, should those BBC shows be available elsewhere? Well, we're starting to see some streaming efforts, BritBox, Acorn TV, that type of stuff. Whether they're viable, who knows? The streaming market's still in flux right now.
Yeah.
Right. But, again, this is an example with the streaming market coming out. Do you need public media to provide that?
Well, again, there's you got to look at it from 2 points of view. If it is indeed that central infrastructure where we can all meet in a nonpartisan square, then yes, it would be worth funding. But at this point, it's a town square that's only welcome to liberals. And at that point, you lose your justification for taking tax dollars for it. That's a private organization at that point serving their own interests.
Right. And this is that Yuri Berliner article. He was a NPR business editor who, I think it was last December, publishes that article in the Free Press that just excoriates.
And they got fired by them.
Yeah, got fired by him, or got hired by Free Press after NPR let him go or forced him out.
But they insist they don't have a political slant, even though the top NPR Nation group of 92 people are all registered Democrats. They insist that they're fair and unbiased. You and I have both been NPR and BBC, and we've been consuming their content. I have for 20 years, probably longer. And I remember with great nostalgia some of the shows. I loved the content. I still listen to Wait, Don't Tell Me every Sunday.
Yeah.
But even the politics have crept in there. And at this point, I just check in on these NPR programs just to hear if they're still politically slanted. And they're still there they've gotten better since the elimination of the funding. But pretty much the last 5 years, the only reason I've listened to their content is to see if they're still as bad as they've become.
Well, I would go further that it's not just the liberal content. One of the things that also pops up into this is that those radio stations or television stations die and you lose local news. I think one of the problems public media has developed is its urban content.
Yeah.
Which problematizes. So again, a lot of the NPR quote unquote stations in Nevada, and there's about 5 or 6 in places like Panaca, Lund. And if you're watching and trying to figure out where I'm talking about, you see the problem, right? But all those stations do is rebroadcast what's out of Vegas.
Right.
They're simulcast. They're not it's not like they have their own staffs on the ground. Now there are some that do, no doubt about that. But
But their argument that rural radio stations will suffer the most because they're not able to produce that local content is absurd. Just because it's the same content everywhere, so it's
Right.
not.
Right. And
It's not tailored to the local area.
right. And going back, the irony where it's an urban commercial station talking to an urban public media station on what's happening in the rurals, and nobody talks to a rural radio station.
Yeah.
That's I think where this dynamic is interesting.
Well, and it's just, to really illustrate what we're talking about, in case, I don't know how many people actually listen to NPR news anymore, but it just became this game of listening to them report a news story that I'd heard reported in so many other places and just waiting for the moment that they blame it on Trump.
Right. Well,
or global warming.
I mean,
It's either Trump's fault or global warming's fault. And it just became so disingenuous and stifling to me as a listener. And it broke my heart because I wanted to keep loving it the way I loved it in my teens and 20s. And it's just I want that back. I would be happy to pay for it if you went, let's go 20 years back in how we used to do this.
Well, and disingenuousness is sort of interesting because
it's just everything. This is good. People will die. Everything is Trump's fault and people will die. I'm like, good God.
Well, let's take that because Catherine Mayer in some of her other interviews, and it was her job to save the Corporation of Public Broadcasting, so she should have been doing those interviews.
Sure.
But one thing that emerged is, only about 25% of the content on these radio stations supported by the Corporation of Public Broadcasting is NPR, right? The rest of it's local oriented or coming from other sources, right? And there's probably something to that. And PBS is somewhat similar. The question is what that 25% of the content is.
That's exactly what went through my head when I heard that. She was making it sound like we're only 25% of the content. How could we possibly be overwriting the entire, it's no, that 25% is basically state sanctioned propaganda, in my opinion.
Well, but
it's equally destructive, whether it's 25% or 85%.
Well, but if it's 25% of news told from a certain perspective,
right,
and the rest of the programming they do is
local stories.
If it even is local stories, how much of the other content that these local radio stations are buying are sort of nationally syndicated music shows?
Yeah.
They're running the high school football game on Friday nights. That type of stuff. I'm not saying it's not important, but if the news that they claim is the educational content that the Corporation for Public Broadcasting is providing via public media to these local areas, we got a different story than if that 25% of the content was 10% news and 15% of the Philharmonic Orchestra somewhere every weekend. And I suspect in rural areas that's not the case.
Yeah.
I suspect on these rural repeaters that 25% of the content is the news content, which is the problematic stuff.
Well, yeah, and there's a psychological strategy at play where you have a 40-minute program and then you have 15 minutes of the NPR sponsored news and then you have another 40-minute program, and then so basically the listener hears these episodes that are usually great content, but the only news you're hearing is the completely slanted news.
Right.
It gives this illusion that reinforces it every hour or so.
Right.
But it's less than 25% of the content.
Right.
But the psychological effect and the way it's spaced has a very strategic effect. And
right.
It just
Yeah, and that I think is partially where we're at on this, is that in some ways, and as much as I've argued against you make a good podcast, I think public media in its current form is probably an experiment whose time has ended, right? Now, is it going to die? No. We're already seeing, I mentioned the Knight Foundation earlier, the Knight Foundation stepping up about $50 million to save the most pressed radio stations. Tribal areas, interestingly, are probably going to be the hardest hit, but there's also a lot of tribal areas that have commercial stations as well, right? And in fact, it's one of my favorite things driving across the Navajo reservation is listening to the Navajo commercial station.
Okay.
Right? It's a lot of fun.
What kind of, is it just like a typical radio station?
Oh, yeah.
The same type of content?
Yeah. And then, how
important is it to the Native communities?
I think it's huge there
Because you
because
spend a lot of time with the Native
Right.
communities. I have no idea of how to understand what their radio station means to them.
it sort of depends. So let me, this is actually a good discussion.
Yeah.
That we haven't really talked about before. So that Navajo station, I can't remember the call numbers, but that Navajo Nation is fairly, we're talking Grand Canyon to northern New Mexico,
Mhm.
right? So it's a fairly isolated area. That radio station is vital, but it is broadcast in the Navajo language.
Oh,
But so you'll hear some news programming, right? A lot of the music, they'll have a variety of music because that's typical in rural areas. You can't just program one genre,
yeah.
right? You'll have various shows. So they'll have a lot more the music you'll hear at powwows and whatnot.
Yeah.
That's right, which is interesting. But you'll hear the ads,
Yeah.
right? And that's always been the fascinating part to me because they're legitimate ads. And I don't speak Navajo, but it's so funny how you can hear the cadence when somebody gives a phone number,
Yeah.
right? So it's the same cadence you have in English. You're like, oh, they're giving a phone number, and they could be talking about pizza. They could be talking about, it could be a safety issue. Who knows?
I'm actually a very big proponent of giving federal money to tribes to resurrect and maintain their languages. I think it would be it's a tragedy to lose a language because it's more than just another language. It captures a certain brain that
Right.
And language really represents something that could be lost. And in this day and age, everybody's trying to be the same. And I think those languages preserve pieces of culture that we don't want to lose.
See, that's exactly.
But it should be a cultural heritage grant, not a public media grant.
Well, and
this is what I was leading towards. I was like, I love this idea, but actually, those radio stations should be getting cultural heritage grants. Good for them for keeping it out there, because you lose a language if you don't speak the language.
And it's something that shows up. So Duck Valley does have a small radio station up there. It doesn't have a big range. If you've ever seen Smoke Signals, which is one of the first big sort of native oriented films to really break across the barrier, the dynamic of the local radio station there on the res broadcasting, which actually gets us to an issue, right? It's told as a joke in Smoke Signals. This is really great about bringing the native. It's told as a joke, but it's basically a guy that's sitting in his camper and he sits on top and provides this commentary. But what's so fascinating about that is you brought up the issue of podcasting earlier.
Yeah.
And we're in an interesting dynamic because, again, as I pointed out, public media, right, comes out of the time that radio in particular has already existed for 40 years. And early radio, very much like early podcasting now, was incredibly cheap to get into.
Yeah.
Right. So everybody and their brother, and I had a lot of friends that studied this in graduate school because we had I went to Emory. Georgia Tech had a big graduate program.
And radio waves, that's not complicated technology.
Oh, it's not complicated technology. It's relatively easy to build your own set. But I had a number of friends who were, as part of their research, were studying. The South is just overwhelmed. Every 2-bit church is going out and buying a 5,000 watt transmitter and broadcasting on Sundays, right? My university, I went to Oglethorpe University back in the 30s, actually sparked what our president at the time, Thornwell Jacobs, called the University of the Air, offering college courses over the radio, right? This was a huge effervescence, and a lot of that was supported either by commercial activity or, more often, philanthropic activity from foundations like the Kellogg Foundation. By the 50s, the Ford Foundation's a major player.
Yeah.
Now we have the Knight Foundation stepping in to rescue these. What's interesting about that is I see this trajectory that radio comes out with a new technology, proves itself, its mature form, if we can say in the 50s, people start having problems with because it's not as open. It's not as able to cover topics, right? So that increases the push for public support, which is where corporation public broadcasting is. Now we're losing that public support. Maybe it should be allowed to wither on the vine in your expression. But
no, that was the correct step. Is you got a chaotic market and the government stepped in and straightened it out with those subsidies and helped streamline it and regulate it. But to my podcast point, it's, we have a whole bunch of media now being produced privately without money. So it can survive on its own.
But my argument is that might not last long.
Yeah.
I mean,
we can always bring it back.
We could always I think podcasting, to me, in some ways, podcasting is looking a bit like radio was in the 20s and 30s, right? It's wide open field. It's not that expensive to get into. It's a headache to promote yourself, but but look at this. Can we see a situation 10 years down the road where podcasts like this that are focused on rural areas are considered to be too small market for someplace like YouTube to continue to give us server space to stream a channel.
Sure.
And in that point, is there a point in the future where the 775 has to be rescued by a public media grant? I mean, it's a fascinating, speculative. I would vote against us falling into that trap, but it is a speculative comparison.
I want to ask you a question. I'll answer it for myself though. First, how much of your news do you get from local radio stations? And the answer for me is none. What is it for you?
I'd say it's almost none as well.
Yeah.
Right now, I still do read the local paper, which is a whole nother story.
As I was saying, it's a little easy to get lost in the narrative of this discussion. But at the end of the day, how much of your news do you really get from a radio station?
Let's back
up. How much do you depend on that?
What do you mean by news?
Because I'm just thinking most people around here, most people where I'm from, they do a ton of internet Google searching when they want to get into a news story. They're not really dependent on radio telling them what's going on.
Mm-hmm.
So it's just, we've moved past that point of the market.
Well, it depends on what you mean by news, because I do think there is a way. So around here, one of the things we have multiple stations, and a couple of them are actually doing these sort of local interest shows. And I've gone on a number of them talking about community development or promoting various projects or stuff I've done publicly. And I think that's actually vitally important. That's the type of stuff that public media was set up to encourage. But the channels doing this are the commercial channels, right? They have an obligation to the FCC to have some local content, but they're doing it because they know people have an interest in this stuff, which goes back to your point.
And I like that we're kind of wrapping this up on that middle of the road narrative, because it's, it did serve a point in the beginning. And if it were still serving that central town square, I would be happy to keep paying for it. But the problem was that it wasn't a central town square for anything anymore. So it's one of those yes and no things. Yes, it is vitally important if it is implemented the way it's supposed to theoretically. And it wasn't. And, the Doge cut, it's not forever. If we find in 10 years that we want it back, we can always bring it back.
Well, but it would
But
require,
it is important to shake that industry because it has gone so off course. We'll give them a shake up, let them reorient themselves, and let's see what's left. And that should prune back a lot of the BS.
And maybe
for lack of a better term.
You're right. Maybe you don't need a centralized agency that's handing out the money and funding stuff. So it's going to be an issue, but it's certainly one, I think, again, going back to our original argument, where the rurals are sort of being used for an argument that's largely an urban argument. So
I think they just got a little big for their britches, and they need to take some cuts.
So, well, if you got some thoughts on this, go ahead and reach out to us. Send us an email at info@775alive.com. I'm Scott Gaborski.
I'm Crystal Newton.
We'll see you around the 775.